Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to be making saw handles, quite literally from scratch. For those of you who watched the videos all the way to the end, you may have seen recently that there's a new name at the top of the list, Alex Adams. He is the man, and a part of that status is I'm going to make a specific tool for him. Particularly, I'm actually going to be making two different back saws for him. And he sent me this walnut burl to make one out of. I thought this would be a good chance for me to make a tenon saw for myself, so I'm going to do it out of this live oak burl. And we're going to be having a good bit of fun because, yeah, this can be a very, very scary step. But if you take it step by step, this can actually be very easy. And then everything else is kind of straightforward. Let's dive in. So let's start by figuring out how big these need to be. I have these patterns that I have gotten from Blackburn Toolworks. I'll leave a link to that down below. And they are phenomenal. You can change them by size, by type, the look you want, and then make them fit your hand. And I can kind of lay them out on the piece and figure out how big of a handle can I get out of this? Can I actually get a piece out of these? And sometimes you can't. There might be inclusions or other problems that get in your way, and so you have to kind of work around them. If you do this quite often, you may actually want to make one out of a piece of plexiglass so you can see through it. It makes it very, very easy to work around. But in my case, I don't make them that often, so we're just going to use a piece of paper. And then we can rough cut them, and this is going to cut them close to the lines-ish. I want to basically make a small block that will fit that particular handle. And so most of this is just done with big saws. I don't care about the grain quality. Because we're doing these out of burl, we're going to need to stabilize them so that any pore or any inclusion in the middle is well filled in. So we're going to cut them roughly, but I want to cut them as small as I can so that they can actually fit in my vacuum. Once we make them a little bit smaller, then we can actually take them down to their final thickness. You'll see these are very rough cut, and when later we get to the walnut burl, you'll see how we resaw these down to shape. But I want to bring them down to about 0.9 inch, so 9/10 of an inch thick-ish. A little bit more than that is okay. You can always file it back later, and very little of this will actually end up being the full thickness. So we want to get it close to that, but you don't have to be terribly specific. Some people actually like a slightly thicker handle. Some people like a slightly thinner handle. So this is a chance where you can make something that fits yourself. For me, I mark it at 9/10 of an inch and then kind of get close from there. On this first one, I decided to put the pattern on there, cut it a little bit smaller, and then do the stabilization, which means I'm going to have to put another pattern on later. So now we're going to switch over to the walnut burl. Two of these will be made out of walnut burl. One of them will be made out of the live oak burl. The two for walnut are actually for Alex Adams. So it's really beautiful stuff. And walnut burl is incredibly expensive, as well as the live oak burl. The live oak burl was actually sent to me by another fan of the channel. And Alex Adams, he provided his own walnut burl. So we're going to cut this down and make it about the right length, but it is twice as thick as it needs to be, which is great. We can then resaw this in half and get two handles out of it that match side by side. Burl doesn't exactly butterfly quite as well. They can't book match perfectly, especially when we're taking off a little more thickness. So the two handles won't precisely match because they're in slightly different orientations. There was too many inclusions in one, so they're actually rotated slightly in comparison. But we're going to resaw it down, just making a mark down the middle and splitting the difference. Both of these are a little larger than they need to be, which is just about perfect. It's about 2 inches thick, and so it gives us about 1/10 of an inch on either side we can work with. The burl kind of pinches up, so putting a good bit of paste wax on there makes it out. I'm actually using my hard wax that I sell in my store. It's a mix of raw linseed oil and beeswax and cuts beautifully. It applies the lubricant you need to slide down through there. Even if the saw is pinching a little bit, it cuts out nicely. So there's our two halves, and we can see there's a bit more inclusion in there than I wanted, so that means the stabilizing is going to be that much more important. So in these ones, then we can come through and figure out exactly where the saw handle can come out of, and we can cut off the excess on these. With the excess cut off, now we can start to make the forms to put in the stabilization. Originally, my stabilization was going to be done with cactus juice, and that's a little bit more forgiving, and I could probably just do it with a tinfoil wrap. But I decided to actually do it with epoxy instead. The cactus juice is really good as long as the inclusions aren't very large. It fills small pores very nicely, but you can see on this one there are some larger sections, and the cactus juice doesn't work as well on those. So I decided to go with epoxy instead. So that means it's got to be really, really well sealed. And I ended up putting 2 coats on the side and 3 on the bottom, and this is Tyvek tape. I'll try and leave a link to that down below. But fill it all in and wrap it all up and make sure it's fully coated, and then it still leaks for some reason. But I'm using Total Boat's Thick Set. This is one of my favorites. It's thin enough that you can actually work it down in and it will completely fill all the pores, and it's a very, very clear liquid. I don't need a thick set for this, and it does mean it's going to take a lot longer to cure. I could use a high performance on it that will cure much faster, but it's not quite as thin, and so it won't get into all the small pores. The thick set really will do that. Here I'm kind of playing with the color. I'm trying to get a nice red color, and it is a little bit more red. The camera makes it more pinkish, but it wasn't quite the rich tone. I wanted something a little bit deeper to blend in with the wood. So we're going to add a little bit more black in there and play with the color until it's something we like. And this is right about what I'm looking for, which ends up being a little more magenta than it is in real. Something fun about matching colors in camera. So I'm going to flood it onto this, and there's going to be about an 1/8 inch all across the top of this. Put it down into the vacuum chamber and suck out the air. I have an entire video on stabilizing wood if you want to see that, but the idea is you suck all the air out of the wood, and then when you put the pressure back in, it then pushes the epoxy down into every pore. And I'm going to do this for all 3 of the handles, making sure that they get a full soak. Some people think it's the vacuum that actually sucks the epoxy into the wood. It is not. It is actually the air pressure when you put it back on. So you want to make sure you get all the air out of the wood you can, and then when you put the pressure back in, it pushes the epoxy deep into the pores. And you want to leave it in there the full time while it cures. To get the epoxy off, we need to plane and saw it off. Sometimes the epoxy kind of sticks to the bottom of the plane, so if you put on some hard paste wax, that stops it, and it actually works really well. So I want to take off as much of the excess epoxy, get down to the bare wood, because there's a good bit of extra on here. It's better to have too much than too little, but that allows us to get down to a surface that we can then put the form on and start actually shaping the handle. I know we're almost halfway into the video and we haven't actually gotten to shaping the handle, because a lot of the work is in the prep of getting the right piece of wood. And this was, I could have let it to set a little bit longer. It's still at a very thick taffy stage, but it made it a little bit easier to plane off the heavy stuff on here. So this was easier to take off, though it was a little more gummy, and so the paste wax on the plane helps that out. Once we're down to a good flat surface and we're trued up, then we can apply the pattern on there and start drilling all of the holes. One of the nice things about the patterns is they actually have marks and sizes for drilling holes. You have a lot of round radiuses in the saw, and so it makes it much, much easier to do that. Once more, we're going to play the game of where exactly is this going to fit in. I want to stay away from some of the inclusions. I want to make sure that the saw has a good grain running around it. With normal grain, you want the grain to be perfectly straight and clean and running front to back along the saw. You can see the dotted line showing the direction the grain should be on the patterns. But with the burl, the grain is running in all directions, so I'm trying to get the grain to wrap around the handle, giving it as much strength as possible. We're going to be pre-drilling all of the starter holes for the augers, and yeah, this thing is like demon-possessed. It's kind of odd. But once all those are set in place, we can come in with the augers. One of the reasons for doing the pre-drilling is that it means that we're not going to be splitting out the wood quite as easily. And I love when you have a really good auger and you got these curls coming off. It's really nice to get those beautiful auger curls that you generally don't see for a cheap auger. And you know it's sharp and the wood is good when those are continuous and running. Really pleasing. So there's a bunch of different holes that have to be drilled, and they're all different sizes. And so I'm going to drill halfway from one side and then use the lead hole poking through to then drill from the other side so that we can meet in the middle and get a good clean entrance and exit. Most of these, the clean entrance and exit doesn't matter that much because we are going to be rounding them off, but it's just good practice in general. Now that we have all of the holes drilled out, we can start doing all of the saw work. We want to take this this down closer to its size. If I had a really good scroll saw or a bandsaw or something of that nature, I'd just use that to go around the outside perimeter. My scroll saw won't do anything thicker than 3/4 inch, and it's not really good for this. I could also use a turning saw, but I find the turning saw to be a lot slower, and generally I prefer to make a lot of straight cuts, and those get me very, very close to the actual size. And you can actually straight cut all the way around this and get unbelievably close to the final shape on this, with the exception of the inside of the handle. So you can see on all of these, I'll come down at a V cut, and then I'll come in with another V cut and match in the middle, and I can take out chunk after chunk until I get right down to the edge. It actually goes relatively quickly, and I find this to be considerably faster than doing it with a turning saw. But everyone's a little different. Some people will say a turning saw is the better method, so find the method that works for you and go to town cutting it. But then it leaves us with the middle, and that you have to do with a turning saw, or a bandsaw, or a scroll saw, or something of that nature. And so I'm going to actually be using the turning saw to run around the pattern. I'm going to stay a little ways away from the edge because I can always grind it back to the edge, which is very quickly done with a rasp. We'll be covering that in a little bit. But getting it in here and then rotating it around to follow all the directions, especially when you get into the lamb's tongue, that little portion is very, very delicate and easy to mess up. So being able to use the turning saw to hit it just right and still stay away from the lines makes it very useful. Yeah, epoxy started sticking to my feet. Wonder why. Now we can get into the actual shaping. This is the fun part, and this is the very slow and tedious part. You do not want to rush this. You want to take it slow. I have somewhere between 15 and 20 files and rasps out on the bench, all different profiles, all different sizes. Some of them I use, some of them I don't, and every one is going to be a little bit different. The idea is you start with a very coarse rasp, and then you take it close to its shape. Then you move on to a fine rasp, and that gets rid of a lot of the marks from the coarse rasp. And then you can move it down to a rough file. And the rough file starts to get rid of the marks from the rasps and gets you right down to your edge, but it's still going to leave marks. And so then you get into a fine file that gets rid of most of the marks and gets you very, very close, almost exactly on your side. And then you go to an ultra fine file, and that ultra fine file removes almost all the marks, though it still leaves a little bit. And then you can come in with a scraper or sandpaper and really detail it. And then after that, you even come in with a polisher and you clean that all up. But for the general shaping of the handle, I'm going to stop at the fine, the ultra fine file. For a lot of these little details, you need to come in with very detailed files, and I have a set of feather files that fit in there really beautifully, especially with that lamb's tongue. I like to cut in a little bit with a saw and get that reliefed detail. And most of this process, once you get it close to shape, is just getting rid of the marks from the previous tool. And you can really get obsessed very, very quickly on this. And it's one of these things where you're never done. You're always looking for that next mark, and at some point you just have to draw the line and say, it's close enough. But then you get into all these little details of the lamb's tongue and the V teeth, and wow, you can spend a lot of time on it. Having one with a safe side like this makes it incredibly easy, so you can work right up next to a corner and not having to worry about running into it. And I have a whole set of files that have safe sides as well. It's common with floats. You're also going to want to come in with a file card, and clean off your files from time to time. They do get clogged, and you'll notice that they suddenly cut much, much better. On the horns, you want to round them over so that they're not sharp in the corners. And I'll do most of that with the chisel, and then come in with the files and shape them down in. And again, you're just looking at all of these little details and making them all fit. And you want to round one side to match the other until you get that exact profile, and then constantly be holding it in your hand and seeing what feels good, what doesn't, and make adjustments as you go, because the feel is what's important. The two most important things on a whole handle are the two horns. This horn should grab the webbing of your hand, and this horn should rest nicely on that, so that when there's just a handle on here, you can hold the handle without anything else. It should grab your hand by itself. That lets you know that's a good handle. It fits and shapes, it holds itself. Whereas a cheaper handle, that horn doesn't actually grab the webbing, and so it won't hold on. Even if it were just the weight of the handle, that wouldn't be there. A good handle fits and holds nicely. Once you get the shape down, and it's right about where you want, it's got a good feel, it fits your hand, now you're about halfway through the process. This is the next step that takes forever ever, and it is very, very important. You want to make sure that everything is clean and smooth, and it's a lot of detailing. I'll be working with an ultra fine file, I'll be working with a rasp, I'll be working with sandpaper, and I'll go back and forth. The sandpaper actually shows you a lot of where the marks are that you need to adjust and clean up, and you'll just be working at this for a long time, and the longer you go at it, the more marks you find, and eventually you find you've just basically ground through the whole handle trying to get rid of all the marks. It does take time. It can be very boring, and you're going to have to focus on it. But when you're done, it's well worth it. Just keep going, and keep going, and keep going, and keep going, and keep going. But eventually, you'll have a saw handle. And you'll wake up one day and be like, wow, this is really nice. And then you can finally get to the finishing. I actually like to put on a coat of boiled linseed oil just to let it soak in, and I get to see where some of the marks are that I still need to go back and hit. And at this point, I'm going to start doing the fitting to the saw plate and all of the nuts and things of that nature. And then I'll do a final cleanup on it later. But this is the vast majority of it. Once you've gotten to this point, the rest of it is just detail work. You don't have to do anything more. You can, but at this point, you get to enjoy some finish going on there. And putting the boiled linseed oil on there really makes a lot of those imperfections pop out that you can come back in and hit a little bit later. But this is such a pleasing moment when you really start to see the burl come through and all of the grain popping out, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. Some of the contrast with the little bits of epoxy in some of the gaps. So pleasing. And yeah, it makes every moment of that long and tedious process worth it when you start to see all of that coming out. And for the rest of the time using the saw, you get to think about all the time you spent on this and how much love went into it, and it is worth every moment of it. So happy. So there you have it, saw handles. Now, a couple questions I'm going to be getting. Number one, big question is, isn't burl going to be very warped and twisted? So there you have it, saw handles. If you take it step by step, they are relatively easy and most people can do it. It is a bit more advanced and you got to be careful with things. You got to take it slowly, but most people can do it, especially if you follow the format, and I will leave links to those down below. It is a relatively simple thing. Just take your time and understand. This whole process took me about 20 hours to make these 3 from scratch. Yeah, it's a decent amount of work. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, but when you're first getting into them, they take a while. Now, some of you may notice that there are still file marks and other things on these. I haven't sanded them completely, as I showed at the end of the video. I did that on one side of one of them just to add that into the video. I do that after I've done all of the rest. So next time we're going to be coming in and cutting the slot for the plate. We're going to be cutting the slot for the back. We're going to be drilling the holes and doing the mounting, cutting the teeth on the plate itself, doing all the fitting that's required of that, even doing some etching in the plate. There's lots of other things that have to be done to the rest of the saw. Then once all that's done and I know everything's fit and exactly where it should be, then I can come back to this and I can do all of the finished detail. I do like to put a coat of finish on this before doing the detail because it makes you see all of those marks far better, so you can come back and remove them far easier. I may end up putting 3 coats on this over the time as I sand it down and work it back in. So one of the nice things about boiled linseed oil is you can put a coat over a coat without really changing the color much. And so being able to apply that on there and clean it out really shows you where all those marks are. So we'll be doing that in the next time where we build the rest of the saw. If you do have any other questions that I didn't address, throw those down in the comments down below. I do read through all of them and I answer as many of them as I can get to. So thank you. That does actually help out the channel. It helps us grow in front of more people. And even if you just put a comment down below that says comment down below, that helps out, thank you. As well as hitting the like, the share, the subscribe, that get us in front of more people and help the channel to grow. But if you want to take it one step farther, there is a bunch of people scrolling over the side. They are the patrons on Patreon, and particularly the guy at the top of the list. He is Alex Adams. He's the guy I am making these 2 for. So thank you for supporting the channel, quite literally keeping the lights on, keeping this channel coming. Without patrons on Patreon, we wouldn't exist. So thank you for that. And I'm hoping you're going to be liking your 2 saws because I'm going to be having a lot of fun making them. I think that'll about do it for now, and until next time, have a wonderful day. A lot of people ask for the truth about exactly how long it took to make these, but let me tell you, you can't handle the truth.